The flames danced against the midnight sky like demons celebrating their destruction. Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the wooden fence, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The acrid smoke burned her lungs as she watched everything she had ever known disappear into the hungry orange mouth of the fire. Her family's ranch house, where 3 generations had lived and loved, was now nothing more than timber feeding the beast that had awakened in the dry Kansas grasslands. She clutched her grandmother's jewelry box against her chest, the only thing she had managed to save when the flames suddenly surrounded their property. The wooden box felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands, but it contained the last connection to her family's legacy. Her parents had died in a wagon accident 2 years ago, leaving her alone to manage the struggling ranch. Now even that was gone. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the crackling roar of the fire. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Knew those riders weren't coming to help. Buck Morrison and his gang had been circling her property for months like vultures, waiting for the right moment to strike. They wanted her land, and they had made it clear that a woman alone had no business owning such valuable grazing territory. "Well, what do we have here?" Buck's gravelly voice carried across the smoky air as his horse came to a stop near the fence. Even in the firelight, Sarah could see the cruel smile spreading across his weathered face. "Looks like your little ranch had some bad luck tonight, Miss Mitchell." Sarah's throat felt dry as sand. She knew Buck and his men had started this fire. The wind had been still all evening. Fires didn't just spring up on their own in 3 different locations around her property. But knowing it and proving it were 2 different things entirely. "A shame about the house," continued Buck, dismounting his horse with deliberate slowness. "Of course I did warn you about the dangers of living out here all alone. These prairie fires can be mighty unpredictable." 2 more riders emerged from the smoke, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. Sarah recognized them as Buck's most loyal followers, men who would do anything for money and had no conscience about how they earned it. Her nearest neighbors lived 15 miles away, and no one would hear her if she screamed. "What do you want, Buck?" Sarah managed to whisper, though she already knew the answer. "Same thing I've always wanted, darlin'. Your signature on a bill of sale. Of course, now that your house is gone and your cattle scattered, the price has gone down considerable." Buck pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and waved it in the air. "I'm prepared to offer you $50 for the whole spread." It's mighty generous considering the circumstances. $50 for land worth 20 times that amount. Sarah felt sick. Her father had paid $800 for this property, and that was when land was cheaper. The creek running through the middle made it worth even more now, especially during the dry seasons when water became precious as gold. "I'm not selling," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Not to you, not to anyone." Buck's smile disappeared. "Now that's disappointing to hear. I was hoping we could settle this like civilized folks." He nodded to his companions, who began moving to flank her on either side. "See, the thing is, Miss Mitchell, I don't think you understand your situation. You got no house, no cattle that I can see, and no protection. A woman alone out here. Well, all sorts of terrible things could happen." Sarah clutched the jewelry box tighter and took a step backward. The fence pressed against her spine, reminding her that she had nowhere to run. The fire had died down some, but it still cast an eerie glow across the men's faces, making them look like creatures from her worst nightmares. "I suggest you reconsider my offer," Buck said, pulling out his gun and examining it casually. $50 is better than nothing, which is what you'll have if you keep being stubborn." The sound of another horse approaching made everyone freeze. Through the dissipating smoke, a lone rider appeared, sitting tall in his saddle despite the late hour. Sarah couldn't make out his features clearly, but something about his posture suggested confidence and calm strength. And a hat pulled low over his face. "Evening, gentlemen," the stranger called out, his voice carrying a hint of a southern drawl. "Mighty late to be conducting business, isn't it?" Buck spun around, his gun still in his hand. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. Keep riding." The newcomer dismounted his horse with fluid grace and stepped into the circle of firelight. Sarah caught her breath. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s. With strong shoulders and a lean build that spoke of years spent working hard under the sun. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. steady and alert, missing nothing. "Afraid I can't do that," the stranger replied, his hand resting casually on his own gun belt. "See, I don't like the odds here. 3 armed men against 1 unarmed woman doesn't sit right with me." "Like I said, this isn't your concern," Buck snarled, raising his weapon. Last chance to ride away. The stranger's response was so quick that Sarah almost missed it. In one smooth motion, he drew his gun and had it trained on Buck before the other man could fully raise his own weapon. The 2 other riders reached for their guns, but found themselves staring down the barrels of a second pistol that had appeared in the stranger's left hand as if by magic. "I'd think real careful about your next move, boys," the stranger said, his voice still calm, but carrying a note of steel that made Sarah's spine straighten. "Now, why don't you all just mount up and ride away?" The ladies had enough excitement. For one evening, for a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the distant crackling of dying flames and the nervous shifting of horses. Sarah held her breath, waiting to see which way the confrontation would go. Buck Morrison's face turned red with rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to test the stranger's aim. The moonlight reflected off the twin barrels pointed directly at him and his men, and something in the newcomer's steady stance suggested he knew exactly how to use those weapons. After what felt like an eternity, Buck slowly lowered his gun and holstered it. "This isn't over, Miss Mitchell," he growled, never taking his eyes off the stranger. "You can't have someone protecting you every minute of every day." "Maybe not," the stranger replied evenly, "but I reckon she can take care of herself just fine. And word has a way of getting around about men who prey on defenseless women. Tends to make a fellow unpopular in these parts." Buck's jaw worked as if he wanted to say more, but he jerked his head toward his companions instead. "Come on, boys. We'll finish this conversation another time." The 3 men mounted their horses and rode off into the darkness, but not before. Buck turned back one final time. "Remember what I said, Sarah? This land will be mine one way or another." When the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, the stranger finally lowered his weapons and turned to face Sarah. In the dying firelight, she could see him more clearly now. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat, and a face that was both rugged and kind. There was something familiar about his features, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, holstering his guns with the same fluid motion he had used to draw them. Sarah realized she was still clutching her grandmother's jewelry box like a lifeline. Her hands were shaking so badly that the contents rattled softly inside. I'm fine. Thank you, if you hadn't come along." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Name's Jake Russell," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed both formal and natural. "I was riding through when I saw the fire. Figured someone might need help. Sarah Mitchell. This is ... This was my ranch." She gestured helplessly at the smoldering remains of her home. In the pale light of dawn that was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon, the destruction looked even worse. The house was completely gone, except for the stone foundation and the iron stove. It sat like a lonely monument in the ashes. Jake surveyed the damage with experienced eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Mitchell. Fires can be terrible things." He paused, then added quietly, "Though this one looks like it had some help getting started." Sarah nodded miserably. "Buck Morrison has been trying to buy my land for months. When I kept refusing, he started making threats." She looked around at the devastation. "I guess he decided to make good on them. Morrison." Jake's voice carried a note of recognition that made Sarah look at him sharply. "I've heard that name before. He's been causing trouble all through the territory, buying up land from folks who suddenly find themselves having run of bad luck. You know him?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Our paths have crossed before. He and his gang burned out a family near Abilene last month, good people who wouldn't sell their farm." His expression hardened. "The sheriff there was too scared to do anything about it." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What happened to the family?" "They survived, but just barely. Lost everything, just like you." Jake looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "Difference is you stood up to him. That took courage." "Courage or stupidity?" Sarah said bitterly. "Look where it got me. You're alive and you still own your land. That's something." Jake walked over to where the barn had once stood. Miraculously, the stone well, had survived the fire, along with the windmill that drew water up from deep underground. You've got water, and the grazing land looks untouched. That's a foundation to build on. Sarah almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Build what? I don't have any money to rebuild, and even if I did, Buck would just burn it down again. Maybe next time he won't wait for you to come riding to the rescue. Jake turned back to her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. What if you didn't have to face him alone? I don't understand. I've been looking for a place to settle down, somewhere I could start fresh. This is good land, and you're going to need help working it if you want to make it pay. He gestured toward the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I could stay on as a hired hand, help you rebuild. Morrison might think twice about bothering you if you've got protection. Sarah stared at him. You don't even know me? Why would you want to help? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. Let's just say I know what it's like to lose everything and have nowhere to turn. Sometimes a stranger's kindness is the only thing standing between you and complete despair. There was something in his tone that suggested he was speaking from experience, but Sarah didn't press. She studied his face, trying to read his intentions. He could be anyone, a drifter, an outlaw running from his past, or worse, one of Buck Morrison's men sent to gain her trust. But something in his steady gaze and the way he had faced down 3 armed men to protect her made her want to believe he was genuine. I can't pay much, she said finally. I've got maybe $30 left in my name, and that has to last until I can figure out how to make this place profitable again. Room and board is payment enough for now. We can work out the details later. Jake walked back toward his horse, then paused. Of course, if you'd rather handle Morrison and his boys on your own, I understand. Not everyone wants help from a stranger. Sarah looked around at the ashes of her old life, then at the man who had appeared out of the smoke like an answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was praying. She thought about Buck Morrison's threats and the cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he watched her home burn. Then she thought about her parents and her grandmother and how they had never given up no matter how hard things got. Mr. Russell, she called out just as he reached his horse. He turned back, waiting. If you're serious about staying, I could use the help. But I should warn you, Buck Morrison doesn't give up easy. This won't be over just because you scared him off tonight. Jake smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. Miss Mitchell, I wouldn't have it any other way. The first week of working together passed in a blur of hard labor and careful politeness. Jake proved to be everything he had promised and more. He worked from sunrise to sunset without complaint, and his knowledge of ranching impressed Sarah daily. He knew how to track scattered cattle, repair damaged fences, and even had ideas about where to dig a new well if the current one ever ran dry. They had managed to salvage enough lumber from the barn to build a small cabin where Sarah could sleep. Jake insisted on bedding down in the lean-to shelter they constructed near the animals, claiming he preferred sleeping under the stars anyway. Sarah suspected he was just being a gentleman, but she appreciated his consideration nonetheless. What surprised her most was how comfortable she felt around him. Despite being virtual strangers, they fell into an easy rhythm of shared work and quiet conversation. Jake never pried into her personal affairs, and Sarah returned the courtesy by not asking about his past, though she often caught herself wondering about the shadows that sometimes passed across his face when he thought she wasn't looking. On their 8th morning together, Sarah woke to the sound of hammering. She stepped outside her cabin to find Jake constructing what looked like the frame of a much larger building. "What are you doing?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Building you a proper house," Jake replied without pausing in his work. "This cabin is fine for now, but winter's coming, and you'll need something more substantial." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Jake, I told you I don't have money to pay for materials, let alone already taken care of." Jake straightened and wiped sweat from his forehead. "I rode into town yesterday while you were working with the horses. Had a talk with Mr. Henderson at the lumber yard." "You bought lumber with your own money?" Sarah's voice rose in dismay. I can't let you do that. It's too much. Jake's expression grew serious. Miss Mitchell, let me ask you something. Do you trust me? The question caught her off guard. Yes, I suppose I do. Then trust me when I say, I know what I'm doing. He gestured toward the frame taking shape before them. This house will be built solid enough to withstand anything Morrison might throw at it, including fire. Stone foundation, thick walls, metal roof. It'll be a fortress if it needs to be. Sarah stared at the construction, her mind racing. Amount of money Jake must have spent would have taken her months to earn, if she could earn it at all. Why are you doing this? Don't tell me it's just because you need a job. No hired hand spends his own savings on his employer's property. Jake set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. For a moment, Sarah thought he was going to give her another vague answer about helping strangers in need. Instead, he surprised her by saying, because I've been where you are now. I know what it feels like to watch everything you've worked for go up in flames. What happened to you? Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. I had a spread down in Texas near San Antonio. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. I was engaged to marry the banker's daughter. Had plans to expand the herd, maybe start a family. He picked up a piece of wood and turned it over in his hands. Then the Comanches came through. Sarah had heard stories about the Comanches. Bands of traders who dealt with hostile Indian tribes, often selling them weapons and supplies in exchange for stolen goods. They were feared throughout the frontier for their ruthlessness. They burned us out, stole what they could carry, and killed anyone who tried to stop them. My fiancée was visiting when they came. Jake's voice grew even quieter. She didn't make it out. Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathy. Jake, I'm so sorry. He shrugged, but she could see the pain still etched in the lines around his eyes. That was 3 years ago. Spent 2 of those years tracking the men who did it. Found most of them, eventually. There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah's blood run cold. Found them. Justice isn't always found in a courtroom, Miss Mitchell. Sometimes a man has to make his own. Jake looked directly at her. I'm not proud of what I became during those years. But when I saw Morrison and his men threatening you the other night, it reminded me that there are still good people worth protecting in this world. Sarah absorbed this revelation in silence. She was sharing her property with a man who had admitted to hunting down and presumably killing the men who destroyed his life. By all rights, she should be terrified. Instead, she found herself feeling safer than she had in months. Is that why you carry 2 guns? She asked softly. Jake nodded. Old habits. I keep telling myself I don't need them anymore, but then situations like the other night remind me why I started carrying them in the first place. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sun climb higher in the morning sky. Finally, Sarah spoke again. What happened to your land in Texas? Sold what was left to pay for the funerals. Didn't have the heart to rebuild there. Too many memories. Jake picked up his hammer again. I've been drifting ever since, doing odd jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Now, what makes this place different? Jake paused in his work and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Maybe it's not the place that's different. Maybe it's the company. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn toward the main road. 3 riders were coming toward them at a leisurely pace, and Sarah's stomach clenched when she recognized the lead figure. Duck Morrison, she whispered. Jake's demeanor changed instantly. The relaxed, gentle man she had been talking with disappeared, replaced by someone alert and dangerous. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt. Get inside the cabin, Sarah, but please. The urgency in his voice brooked no argument. Sarah hurried into the cabin but positioned herself near the window where she could see what was happening. Jake stood calmly beside his construction, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Buck and his 2 companions rode right up to the building site and dismounted. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the ugly smile on Buck's face. Oh. Well, Buck called out loudly enough for Sarah to hear inside the cabin. Looks like Miss Mitchell found herself a carpenter. It's mighty neighborly of you, stranger. Just earning my keep, Jake replied evenly. Funny thing, though. I was in town yesterday, and old Henderson mentioned someone paid cash for enough. Lumber to build a real fine house? Good lumber, too, not the cheap stuff. Buck walked closer to Jake, his hands hanging loose at his sides. Now, what kind of hired hand has that kind of money just lying around? Jake didn't answer, but Sarah saw his stance shift slightly, preparing for trouble. Buck continued his casual approach. You know what I think? I think you're not just any drifter. I think maybe you're the kind of man who's got reasons for carrying 2 guns and paying cash for things. The kind of man who might have wanted posters with his face on them. Think whatever you like, Jake said calmly.
Ow.
Oh, I intend to. Buck stopped just out of arm's reach, his smile turning predatory. See, I've got friends in a lot of places. Friends who know about men like you. I'm thinking Miss Mitchell might be very interested to learn exactly who she's invited to share her property. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. If Buck really did have connections, who could uncover Jake's past? What would they find? More importantly, would Jake run rather than risk exposure? Buck Morrison's threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah watched from the cabin window as Jake remained perfectly still, neither advancing nor retreating. There was something about his stillness that reminded her of a mountain cat she had once seen just before it struck. You seem mighty curious about other people's business, Morrison, Jake said finally, his voice carrying across the morning air with deceptive calm. Makes me wonder what you're trying to hide. Buck's confident smile faltered slightly. I'm not hiding anything. I'm a respected businessman in this territory. Businessman. Jake seemed to taste the word, what you call burning out families. Who won't sell to you? Is that what you call threatening women who are all alone? You better watch your mouth, stranger, or what? You'll burn down another house. Send your boys to rough up another defenseless person. Jake took a step forward, and something in his movement made Buck instinctively step back. See, here's what I think, Morrison. I think you're used to dealing with people who are too scared or too weak to fight back. But I'm neither scared nor weak. One of Buck's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, reached for his gun. Jake's response was lightning quick, his right-hand weapon drawn and pointed at the man before the other could clear leather. I wouldn't, Jake said conversationally. I'm feeling a mite jumpy today, and my trigger finger gets twitchy when I'm nervous. The thin man froze, his gun half drawn. Buck's face had gone pale beneath his tan. You're making a big mistake, Russell. You don't know who you're dealing with, Russell? Sarah's breath caught. She pressed closer to the window, her heart pounding. Buck knew Jake's name. How was that possible? Jake's expression didn't change. Oh, but you're wrong about that, Morrison. I know exactly who you are. Buck Morrison, age 42, wanted for cattle rustling in New Mexico, suspected of arson in Colorado, and currently operating a protection racket throughout Kansas territory. Jake's smile was cold as winter wind. The real question is, do you know who I am? Buck's confident facade crumbled completely. His hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when Jake's second pistol appeared in his left hand as if by magic. My name is Jake Russell, Jake continued, his voice carrying a note of steel that made Sarah shiver. Some folks call me the Abilene Ghost, on account of how I have a habit of showing up where I'm least expected. He paused, letting that sink in. Ring any bells, Morrison? Sarah saw Buck go completely white. Even from inside the cabin, she could see his hands starting to shake. She had never heard of the Abilene Ghost, but clearly Buck had, and the name terrified him. That's impossible, Buck whispered. The Abilene Ghost is just a story, a legend. Legends have a way of being based on truth. Jake's voice remained conversational, but his guns never wavered. For instance, there's a legend about a man who spent 2 years hunting down the Comancheros who destroyed his life. They say he was like smoke, there 1 minute, gone the next. They say he could track a man across 100 miles of desert and put a bullet through his heart from 600 yards away. Buck was backing toward his horse now, his 2 companions following suit. None of them were willing to take their eyes off Jake's guns. They also say, Jake continued, following them step by step, that this particular ghost has a real soft spot for folks who prey on women and children. Gets downright unfriendly about it, from what I hear. "This isn't over, Russell," Buck managed, but his voice cracked like a teenager's. "Oh, but it is." Jake's tone was final. "You see, Morrison, I'm done drifting. I'm done running. Yeah. I found something worth staying for, and I'll be damned if I let scum like you destroy it." He raised his voice so it carried clearly. "You come back here, you threaten Miss Mitchell again. You even think about burning anything else that belongs to her. And legend or not, I will hunt you down like the rabid dog you are." Buck and his men mounted their horses with clumsy haste. As they prepared to ride away, Buck turned back one final time.
This territory isn't big enough for both of us. Ghost.
"Then I suggest you find yourself a new territory," Jake replied. Calmly, Sarah watched the three men ride away as fast as their horses could carry them. Only when they had disappeared completely did Jake holster his weapons and turn toward the cabin. Sarah met him at the door, her mind reeling with questions. "The Abilene ghost?" she asked. Jake's shoulders sagged slightly as if the confrontation had drained him. "Not a name I'm proud of, but it served its purpose. Is it true, what you told Buck about hunting down the Comancheros?" Jake nodded slowly. "Every word. I became something I never wanted to be, Sarah. Something cold and hard and focused on nothing but revenge." He looked directly at her, and she could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm not that man anymore, at least. I'm trying not to be." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Instead, she saw only honest regret and something that looked almost like hope. "What changed?" "You did?" The words were so quiet she almost missed them. Sarah felt her breath catch. "Me." Jake nodded. "That first night, when I saw you standing there with nothing left but your courage, it reminded me of why I became the ghost in the first place. It wasn't supposed to be about revenge. It was supposed to be about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And now, I want to be the kind of man who builds things instead of destroying them. It's the kind of man who deserves a second chance at something good." Jake gestured toward the half-built house. "I want to be the kind of man worthy of someone like you." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "Jake, I know it's too soon to be talking like this," Jake said quickly. "I know you barely know me, and what you do know probably scares you. But Sarah, I haven't felt this way about anything or anyone since before the Comancheros came. You make me want to be better than I am." Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Jake waited, hardly breathing. "I see a man who risked his life to save a stranger. I see someone who's worked harder in 1 week than most men work in a month, asking nothing in return. I see someone gentle enough to help me save a baby bird that fell from its nest yesterday, but strong enough to face down 3 armed men without flinching." Sarah reached out and touched his hand. "I see a good man, Jake Russell. Whatever you were before, that's what you are now." Jake turned his hand to capture hers, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Sarah, if you'll have me, if you'll give me the chance, I'd like to build more than just a house here. I'd like to build a life with you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of hope rather than sorrow. For the first time since the fire, she could see a future that held something more than mere survival. She could see happiness, partnership, and love growing like flowers after rain. "I'd like that too," she whispered. 3 weeks passed in a haze of happiness that Sarah had never imagined possible. The house was nearly complete, rising from the ashes of her old life like a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Jake had been true to his word about building it. Like a fortress, the walls were thick stone and timber, the windows positioned to allow clear views of anyone approaching, and the roof was made of metal that would never catch fire. Sarah found herself falling more deeply in love with Jake. Each day, he was gentle with her, patient with her occasional moments of fear, and incredibly hard-working. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch steps of her temporary cabin, talking about everything and nothing. Jake told her stories about his travels, carefully edited versions that focused on the beautiful landscapes he had seen rather than the dark purposes that had driven him. Sarah shared memories of her childhood, her parents, and her dreams for the ranch. The physical attraction between them was undeniable. But Jake maintained a respectful distance that both frustrated and endeared her. We would take her hand while they walked, brush a strand of hair from her face when the wind caught it, or place a protective arm around her shoulders when they heard coyotes in the distance. But he never presumed more than she was ready to give, and Sarah appreciated his patience even as her own. Desires grew stronger. It was during the 4th week that their peaceful existence was shattered. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of Jake's voice outside her cabin, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone she couldn't see. She dressed quickly and peered through the window to see Jake talking to a tall man on horseback. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, she could tell the stranger was well-dressed and official-looking. "Jake," she called softly through the door. "It's all right, Sarah. Just give me a minute." But something in his tone told her it was definitely not all right. She waited anxiously until she heard the sound of the stranger's horse departing, then opened the door to find Jake standing with his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. "Who was that?" she asked. Jake turned around slowly, and Sarah's heart sank at the expression on his face. He looked like a man who had just received his death sentence. "U.S. Marshal named Tom Bradley. He's been tracking me for 6 months." Sarah felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. "Tracking you? For what?" "Murder charges. 4 counts." Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. "The Comancheros I killed weren't all wanted men, Sarah. Some of them were just traitors who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The law doesn't make distinctions between justified revenge and cold-blooded killing." Sarah sank onto the porch steps, her mind reeling. What does the marshal want? "He's giving me 24 hours to get my affairs in order before he comes back with a warrant. Professional courtesy, he called it, since I never killed any lawmen, and some folks consider what I did to be justice served." Jake sat down beside her, but didn't touch her. "He'll be back tomorrow morning to arrest me. There has to be something we can do. You could run." "No." Jake's voice was firm. "I'm done running, Sarah. I told you that. Besides, if I ran, Morrison and his gang would be back here before the sun set. You'd be right back where you started, except this time, they'd be even angrier." Sarah felt tears beginning to blur her vision. "So you're just going to let them take? You let them hang you for killing the men who destroyed your life? I knew this day would come eventually. I've been living on borrowed time for 3 years. Jake finally reached for her hand. "But Sarah, I want you to know that these past few weeks with you have been worth it. For the first time since I lost everything in Texas, I felt like I was truly alive again." "Don't talk like it's over," Sarah said fiercely. "We'll figure something out. Maybe I could testify on your behalf. Tell them what kind of man you really are." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Darling, that's not going to matter to a judge. I killed 4 men in cold blood. The fact that they were part of the gang that destroyed my life might get me prison instead of hanging, but it won't set me free." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking furiously. What if they weren't just random traitors? What if you could prove they were all criminals? "What do you mean? You said some of the men you killed weren't wanted by the law? What if they were wanted, just not under the names you knew them by? What if you could prove they were all part of the Comanchero operation?" Jake shook his head. "Sarah, I spent 2 years tracking these men down. If there had been wanted posters or evidence that they were criminals, I would have found it. But you were looking for them as individuals, not as part of an organized gang. What if there's evidence somewhere that connects them all together? What if someone else has been investigating the Comancheros and has proof that every man you killed was a criminal?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. Even if such evidence existed, we'd never find it in 24 hours. Sarah stood up suddenly, pacing across the small porch. "What about the marshal? He's been tracking you for 6 months. He must know details about the case. Maybe he knows something that could help. Sarah, he's here to arrest me, not help me. But what if he's a good man? What if he's just doing his job but would be willing to listen to the truth?" Sarah turned to face Jake with fierce determination. "You saved my life, Jake Russell. You've worked harder than any 10 men to help me rebuild. You've shown me what love feels like. I'm not going to stand by and watch them take you away without a fight." Jake stood and pulled her into his arms. For a moment they simply held each other, drawing strength from their closeness. Sarah could feel the steady beat of Jake's heart against her cheek, could smell the familiar scent of leather and soap that she had come to associate with safety and home. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked softly. "Morning. When Marshall Bradley comes back, we're going to tell him everything. About the Comancheros, about what they did to you and your fiancé, about how you spent 2 years seeking justice that the law couldn't provide." Sarah pulled back. "To look into his eyes, and I'm going to tell him what kind of man you are now, what you've done to protect me and help me rebuild." "Sarah, no, let me finish. If the Marshal is any kind of decent man, he'll at least listen. And maybe, just maybe, he'll be willing to help us find the evidence we need to prove that you were dispensing justice, not committing murder." Jake cupped her face in his hands. "And if he's not willing to help, if he just arrests me and takes me back to stand trial?" Sarah covered his hands with hers. "Then I'll follow you. I'll find a lawyer. I'll testify at your trial. I'll move heaven and earth to prove your innocence. 'Cause I love you, Jake Russell, and I'm not giving up on us." Jake's eyes filled with an emotion so intense it took Sarah's breath away. "I love you too, Sarah Mitchell. It's more than I ever thought possible to love anyone again." He kissed her then, deeply and passionately, pouring all of his love and fear and hope into that single moment of connection. Sarah kissed him back with equal fervor, trying to memorize the feel of his lips, the taste of his mouth, the way his arms felt around her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life." "They're not going to be the end of our happiness," Sarah said firmly. "They're going to be the beginning." The rest of that day passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying tension. Jake continued working on the house as if nothing had changed, but Sarah noticed that he kept his guns closer than usual and frequently paused to scan the horizon. Sarah tried to keep busy with her usual chores, but her mind kept racing through possible arguments she could make to the marshal, ways she might convince him that Jake was a good man who deserved a second chance. As evening approached, they sat together on their usual spot on the porch steps. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening heavens. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you before." Sarah's heart clenched, fearing another revelation that might change everything. "What is it?" "The morning after the fire, when you asked me why I wanted to help you, I said it was because I knew what it was like to lose everything." Jake took her hand. "That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." "What do you mean?" Jake was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "When I saw you standing there in the firelight, clutching that jewelry box and refusing to back down to Morrison despite being outnumbered and defenseless, you reminded me of someone, your fiancé.
Ow!
You reminded me of myself before the Comancheros came. Before I became the ghost, you reminded me of who I used to be, someone who believed in justice and goodness and the possibility of happiness." Jake squeezed her hand. "Saving you wasn't just about protecting a stranger, Sarah. It was about saving the part of myself I thought I'd lost forever." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, and now I know that part of me wasn't lost. Was just waiting for the right person to help me find it again. Jake wiped away her tears with gentle fingers. "Whatever tomorrow brings, you've already saved me in every way that matters." Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch. Sarah had barely slept, spending most of the night in Jake's arms on the porch, talking quietly and holding each other close. Now, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, their moment of reckoning had arrived. Marshal Tom Bradley rode up with 2 deputies, just as he had promised. He was a lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. That had seen too much over the years. Despite his purpose, there was something about his demeanor that suggested fairness rather than cruelty. "Morning, Russell," the marshal called out as he dismounted. "Miss Mitchell," he touched his hat politely. To Sarah, Jake stood slowly, his hands visible and away from his guns. "Marshal Bradley, I appreciate you keeping your word about the 24 hours. A man's word should mean something, even in this business. Bradley's gaze moved between Jake and Sarah, taking in their obvious closeness. I was hoping we could handle this without any unpleasantness. Before you arrest him, Sarah said, stepping forward, I'd like you to hear something. Both of you need to know what really happened here, and what kind of man Jake Russell truly is. The marshal looked surprised. This isn't really, please. Sarah's voice carried a quiet authority that made the man pause. 5 minutes of your time, that's all I'm asking. Marshal Bradley glanced at his deputies, then back at Sarah. Something in her expression seemed to intrigue him. 5 minutes. Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him about the night of the fire, about Buck Morrison's threats, and attempts to force her off her land. She described how Jake had appeared out of nowhere to save her from 3 armed men, risking his own life for a complete stranger. She talked about the weeks that followed, about Jake's tireless work to help her rebuild, his gentleness, his integrity. This man you're here to arrest, Sarah concluded, is not a cold-blooded killer. He's someone who saw injustice and tried to fix it the only way he knew how. He's someone who's spent the past month showing me that there's still goodness in this world. Marshal Bradley listened in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he looked directly at Jake. That's quite a testimonial, Russell. Want to tell me your side of it? Jake straightened his shoulders. Everything she said is true, Marshal. But that doesn't change the fact that I killed 4 men in cold blood. I spent 2 years hunting them down and executing them without trial or jury. I became something dark and vengeful, and I'm not proud of it. But you're saying you're not that man anymore? I'm saying I'm trying not to be, Sarah helped me remember. Who I used to be before grief and rage consumed me. Jake's voice was steady, honest. I won't run, and I won't resist arrest. But I want you to know that if you take me away, Buck Morrison and his gang will be back here before sunset. Sarah will be right back where she started, alone and defenseless. Marshal Bradley absorbed this information thoughtfully. Tell me about... Morrison, Jake, and Sarah exchanged glances. Then Jake began to speak. He told the marshal everything he knew about Buck Morrison's operation, his methods of forcing people off their land, the suspicious fires and accidents that seemed to follow wherever Morrison went. Interesting, the marshal said when Jake finished. Especially since I've been tracking Morrison's gang for the better part of a year, they're wanted in connection with at least 6 suspicious fires, 2 murders, and countless cases of intimidation and extortion. Sarah felt her heart leap with hope. Then why haven't you arrested him? Same reason it's taken me 6 months to track down your friend here. These men are clever, and they cover their tracks well. I've never been able to get enough evidence. To make charges stick, Marshal Bradley studied Jake with renewed interest. But if Morrison is operating in this area, and if Russell here has been protecting potential witnesses, what are you thinking, Marshal? Jake asked. Bradley was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. Finally, he spoke. Russell, I'm going to make you a proposition. It goes against my better judgment, but sometimes a man has to choose between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. Sarah held her breath, afraid to hope. I need someone who can get close to Morrison's operation, someone with the skills and reputation to be credible as a hired gun. The Abilene Ghost would fit that bill perfectly. Bradley looked directly at Jake. You help me gather the evidence? I need to put Morrison and his gang away for good, and I'll recommend clemency for the charges against you. I can't promise you'll walk away free, but I can promise you'll get a fair hearing. Jake was stunned. You want me to go undercover? Infiltrate Morrison's gang? I want you to help me put away the kind of men you've been hunting for 3 years, the kind of men who prey on innocent people and destroy lives for profit. Gestured toward Sarah. And in the process, you'll be protecting the woman you love and countless others like her. Sarah couldn't contain herself any longer. Jake, this could be the answer we've been looking for. A chance to clear your name while stopping Morrison once and for all. But Jake looked troubled. Marshal, if I do this, I'll have to become the ghost again. I'll have to convince Morrison that I'm the kind of man who kills for money. I don't. No. If I can go back to being that person, even as an act. Maybe you don't have to, Sarah said suddenly. Both men looked at her in surprise. What if the ghost has reformed? What if he's tired of running and wants to settle down somewhere quiet, somewhere he won't be bothered by lawmen and bounty hunters? Understanding dawned in Jake's eyes. A gunfighter looking for a peaceful retirement but willing to do one last job for the right price. Marshal Bradley nodded slowly. That could work. Morrison would be suspicious of anyone too eager to join up, but a reluctant recruit who has to be convinced, that might be believable. How would we do it? Jake asked. Simple, I arrest you. Nice and public-like, but then you escape during transport. Word gets around that the Abilene ghost slipped through the marshal's fingers again. You lay low for a few weeks, then approach Morrison with a proposition. You'll work for him. In exchange for protection from the law and a chance to disappear permanently, Sarah felt excitement building in her chest. And while you're working with Morrison, you gather evidence of his crimes. Exactly. With Jake on the inside, we'd finally have the proof we need to shut down Morrison's operation permanently. Bradley looked between them seriously. But I won't lie to you. It'll be dangerous. If Morrison suspects Jake is working for the law, he won't hesitate to kill him. Jake took Sarah's hand and squeezed it gently. What do you think? Are you willing to take the risk? Sarah looked into his eyes and saw the man who had saved her from the fire, who had worked tirelessly to help her rebuild, who had shown her what love could be. She thought about all the other people Morrison had terrorized, all the families he had destroyed. I think, she said firmly, that it's time for Buck Morrison to learn that some ghosts are harder to kill than others. Jake smiled then, the smile that transformed his entire face and reminded her why she had fallen in love with him. All right, Marshal, you've got yourself a deal.
Oh.
Marshal Bradley nodded with satisfaction. Good. Then let's put on a show for anyone who might be watching. Jake Russell, you're under arrest for murder in the first degree. As the marshal placed handcuffs on Jake's wrists, leaned close to Sarah and whispered, "This isn't goodbye, darling. This is just the beginning of getting our life back." Sarah watched them ride away, her heart full of fear and hope in equal measure. In 6 months, either Jake would return to her a free man, or she would lose him forever. But for the first time since the fire, she felt like they were fighting back instead of just surviving. The ghost was riding again, but this time he was riding toward justice instead of revenge. And this time, he had something worth coming home to.